And the counts in the indictment are malice murder, felony murder, aggravated assault, cruelty to children in the first degree. And what I want to do with you, I get to talk to you twice. I get to open and I get to conclude, because the state has the burden of proof in this case. So what I would like to do is spend the first portion of me speaking to you about the law that governs your decision. And I stood before you in opening statements and I said, now's not the appropriate time for me to talk to you about the law, but that will come. And I have tried to give you glimpses throughout the course of this trial by asking the right questions for you to understand what issues you need to pay attention to as it relates to the law. And this is the part where hopefully it all comes together and we can talk about applying the law to the facts. So I'm going to spend my first portion with you just talking about the law. And then after the defense delivers their closing argument, then I will talk to you about how we apply the law to the facts in this case. The state has the burden of proving her guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And everybody has heard that term, but very few people really understand what it means. But what it is the doubt of a fair-minded, impartial juror honestly seeking the truth. And when the judge reads you the law, you're going to hear, embedded in the law at multiple points is that word truth. And what you will see is that a jury trial and your role is about a pursuit of the truth. And the law gives you tools to find it. And what the law says about proof beyond a reasonable doubt is that that is based upon common sense and reason. You are allowed to bring your life experience and your common sense and your reason into that jury deliberation room with you to reach conclusions, to make deductions, to discard stuff that doesn't make sense to you. You are allowed to do that. And the law expressly tells you that you can. What is evidence? The judge is going to talk to you about the different kinds of evidence. There's two kinds of evidence, and you don't really need to worry too much about the distinction between the two because the weight you give them can be the same. But direct evidence is something that somebody saw, like an eyewitness, something that points directly to a fact. And we hear a lot about circumstantial evidence, and it gets kind of a bad rap because it seems like it's less valuable. But really what circumstantial evidence is a set of facts or things that prove something by inference. And I'll give you an example of some circumstantial evidence in this case that we saw. She had cash in her bag. She had a cell phone right there beside her. Those things lead to the inference that she had other options. You can infer, if you wish to do so, that she could have just called 911, that she could have just called an Uber, that she could have just walked out and ran to the neighbor's house next door. You can look at all of the connected surrounding circumstances and you can reach conclusions and make deductions based upon that evidence. You determine the weight to give to the evidence, whether it is direct or circumstantial. That is solely your responsibility as jurors. Now, the judge is also going to tell you that your role is to assess the credibility of the witnesses. And you can consider a lot of things when you're determining the credibility of each witness. And this applies to the statements of the defendant as well, the driver. You can discard whatever it is you want about the statements she made to the expert, the statements she made in the hospital, and you can accept whatever it is you want. You and you alone are the determiners of the credibility of each statement in this case. And the law gives you tools to decide and assess things that you would normally do in your life just based upon common sense. You know, do these people have a reason to lie? Do they have a motive to lie? Do they have anything to gain from the outcome of this case? Things that you use in your everyday life to assess people's credibility, you can do in this case as well. And the judge is going to instruct you that this is the law, the nature of the facts about which they testify, their means and opportunity of knowing the facts about which they testify. And this is true for expert witnesses as well. And I think that that's an important distinction for you to understand. Is that just because somebody comes in here and they're called an expert doesn't mean that you have to automatically accept their testimony or their statement or their conclusions. We saw this week that there were multiple experts and they had varying degrees of thoroughness with regard to what they chose to focus on, with regard to what they assigned weight and significance to, and you can accept or reject any testimony of any expert that came before you this week, just the same as you can with any other witness. The person in this case who has the most to gain is Chloe Driver. And that's clear. We heard evidence from the experts about sort of the cautionary tale that is using the DSM-5 in a forensic setting because the people in a forensic setting necessarily are facing criminal charges and necessarily have reason to kind of exaggerate their symptoms because there are defenses under the law that only apply to them if certain things exist. So that's something that you can evaluate in deciding how much credibility and weight to give to the statements that Chloe Driver made after she had the opportunity to consult with a lawyer and after she understood what her options were for a defense. And I'm going to go through some of her statements in my second closing that she made before she consulted with a lawyer, before she knew the law on insanity. The truest version of her statements about her motivations and why she did what she did was in that hospital when she was writing. It was closest in time to when she committed the act. What you're going to have to determine is what was her mental state at the time she committed the act. So those statements are valuable both in they are the closest in time as you will ever see to her committing the act. And it was prior to her understanding what her options were to get out of the situation she put herself in. So I ask you to assess that in determining which of her versions of statements to assign the most credibility to. Venue. The judge is going to tell you venue is a jurisdictional fact, and every crime has to be prosecuted in the county in which it occurred. And the reason I think this is important to talk to you about in this particular case is because the only crimes committed in Cherokee County were by Chloe Driver. And what I want you to know is that there has been a lot of collateral information put before you about what happened in Asheville, what happened in other places, people that Benjamin has abused elsewhere, crimes committed by third parties. You, me, the judge, nobody in this courtroom has any power or authority to do anything that happened outside of Cherokee County. And so I ask you to focus on what your role is as a juror in this case. And the only crime that happened in Cherokee County was the murder of Hannah Nicole Driver. And I ask you to focus because that is your role and your duty and the oath that you have taken to determine what the law and evidence is regarding the commission of that crime. Whether somebody else has committed other terrible crimes in another jurisdiction is not a question that you are going to be asked today. And it is not a question that you have taken an oath to resolve. So you have to focus your attention in on Hannah, the law as it relates to Hannah, and the evidence as it relates to Hannah. The charges in this indictment are laid out: malice murder, felony murder based on the underlying crime of aggravated assault, felony murder based upon the underlying crime of cruelty to children in the first degree, and then the offenses of aggravated assault and cruelty to children in the first degree. You'll have the indictment back with you, so you'll be able to look at the charging document, count 1, count 2, count 3, count 4, count 5. But I want to walk through a little bit about what the state has to prove to establish each of those crimes. So the first is malice murder. In order to establish and prove malice murder, the state must show that she caused the death of another human being unlawfully and with malice aforethought. And obviously, I told you in the beginning, there's a lot of words in the English language that people know and use, and then the law assigns them maybe a different meaning. So, we say crazy, we say insane, we say mentally ill, and there are definitions to those things and what they mean under the law. There's also a definition about what malice means. So malice does not mean ill will or hatred. And I think that's important because the defense has spent the week talking about how Chloe loved her child. Nobody has to establish that she didn't love her child. The element of the criminal offense is what her intention was in committing the act. And the intention in committing the act of stabbing that child to death doesn't have to be based on ill will or hatred. It can just be the unlawful intent to kill another person without justification. And what malice can also be is when the circumstances show that the defendant did act with a deliberate intention to end someone's life. And we know she did. That she had malice and that she had every intention for Hannah to die. The next count in the indictment is felony murder. Felony murder is when a person causes the death of another by committing a felony. The distinction here is there doesn't have to be any intention to cause the death, there just has to be intention to commit the act. So if you intend to commit the act and it does cause the death, that is a felony murder as long as the underlying act is a felony. And so what we've charged in the indictment is there's one count of malice murder for maliciously and intentionally killing her. Then you have 2 counts of felony murder, and the felonies alleged in those 2 counts are aggravated assault and cruelty to children in the first degree. So if she commits a felony and that causes the death, that's felony murder. And I'll kind of walk you through the underlying felonies in this case as well. So one of the underlying felonies in the indictment that the felony murder count is predicated upon is cruelty to children in the first degree. Cruelty to children in the first degree is when an individual maliciously causes cruel and excessive physical or mental pain to a child under the age of 18 years. So obviously in this case, we know Hannah suffered cruel and excessive pain. We know that. We saw it. We know she was under the age of 18. And we know that the act that she committed was stabbing her in the neck. So all of these elements have been met. With regard to malice used in this, the judge will define it for you, what it means to maliciously cause a child cruel and excessive mental or physical pain. But again, it's not ill will or hatred. Malice just means an intent to cause the pain without justification or excuse. It means a willful doing of the act with a knowledge that the particular harm may result. She committed the act and she had a knowledge that her death, that her cruel and excessive pain would likely result. That is what the definition of malice is in the context of cruelty to children in the first degree. Aggravated assault. In this case, it alleges that she committed the offense of aggravated assault with a knife. Aggravated assault is when an assault is committed against another person with an offensive weapon. The judge will tell you that an offensive weapon can be a number of things. In this case, obviously, we've alleged to say knife, but it's any object that is likely to or does cause death or serious injury to another. And we saw the knife, we know that she used it, and we know that it did result in Hannah's death. The legal elements of each of these offenses and the evidence that came before you is very, very clear. And I understand that the bulk of this case as it relates to the law that's going to get challenging for you guys is the defenses, the insanity defense, and some of the things that sort of pertain to that. So I want to talk about that. Under the law, Chloe Driver is presumed sane. Every person is presumed to be of sound mind and discretion. We start from the proposition that she is sane, that she is criminally responsible for her actions, and that she has to suffer the consequences of her crimes just as any other citizen. That is the position you start from. You may infer that the acts of a person of sound mind and discretion are the product of that person's own will. When the judge will give you this law, she will tell you a person of sound mind and discretion intends the natural and probable consequences of their acts. I will talk to you a little bit more about applying this law to what we know about Chloe Driver and her decisions and the actions that she committed, but it was very, very clear that she understood she was murdering Hannah. And she understood the permanency of that decision. She understood that she was taking away life. And the thing about the law is the law recognizes the value of human life, even if Chloe Driver didn't. When we talk about the insanity defense, the state only has the burden of proving the things I just talked to you about, proving the elements of murder, proving the elements of felony murder, proving the elements of cruelty to children in the first degree, aggravated assault. We have to prove those elements that are contained in the indictment. The defense has the burden of proving her criminal insanity to the extent that she is not criminally responsible. That is not our burden. So that is a difference in the law that is not typical, because usually the state has the burden of proving everything beyond a reasonable doubt. But in this case, because the law presumes she's sane, they have the burden of proving her insanity. You probably noticed in our presentation of evidence, in the state's case, we really just focused on the murder. And in the defense's case, they focus really on the insanity, because that is their burden to raise. It is our burden to focus on the counts and the charges in the indictment before you. You're going to have 4 options on your verdict form. And I think this is important for you to know. It's going to say guilty not guilty by reason of insanity, or guilty but mentally ill. And I will talk to you a little bit more about what each of these mean as we kind of get into the weeds of it. But this will not be as simple of a verdict form as guilty or not guilty. There are other options. But what I want you to understand is, once all this evidence comes before you and once I really explain to you what the law is, you will really be left with 2 options. Guilty or guilty but mentally ill. Based upon the evidence that has come before you, you will not be able to find her not guilty of committing the act. She has admitted that she murdered Hannah. Not guilty is really not an option, based upon her own admissions about the act. And I want to talk to you about the law of insanity and what they must prove and all the reasons why it cannot and has not been proven and will not, the evidence will not show that the law of insanity applies to her. And we'll talk about that more in my second close. But what I want you to understand is that you still are going to be making decisions. Even if you choose guilt, you will have to make decisions with regard to guilt or guilty but mentally ill. So when we talk about the insanity defense, I'm eager to get to my second close so we can talk about the evidence and apply this to the evidence, but bear with me here so I can just explain to you the law before we kind of do that equation and put it all together. There are 2 ways of proving insanity under Georgia law: the inability to distinguish between right from wrong and delusional compulsion. And I want to talk to you about each of those. The inability to distinguish between right and wrong. What the law says is the test is whether the insanity was such that it deprived the person of the mental capacity to distinguish between right and wrong in relation to the act. And the judge will tell you that the question that you have to ask with regard to did she have the capacity to distinguish between right and wrong is her mind so impaired that she is incapable of forming the intent to commit the act, or to understand that a certain consequence would likely result from the act. And when we really get into the weeds and we look at it, it is going to be very, very clear based on her statements to the doctors, her actions, her statements on scene, her statements to the detective, her statements to her mother and Benjamin right after she committed the act. She always knew the wrongfulness of the act. She always knew the consequence of the act. That was never lost on her. She never, ever demonstrated any inability to distinguish between right and wrong. She just chose the wrong. And she understood the result and the consequence of that decision. Delusional compulsion is a little bit trickier, and so I want to walk you through it step by step. You have to have all of these things in order to be found not guilty by reason of insanity based on delusional compulsion. And you will see when I go through this, you'll start to kind of put the pieces together about why we questioned all the experts in the manner that we did. Why are they asking everybody if she was afraid of Hannah? Why are they asking everybody if she ever thought Hannah was a threat to them? Because that's the law. And I want to walk you through it piece by piece. In order to show that she is not guilty by reason of insanity based upon her suffering from a delusional compulsion, what they have to prove is that the defendant was actually laboring under a delusion at the time of the commission of the alleged act. That when she stabbed Hannah to death, she was actively laboring under the compulsion of a delusion. That the criminal act itself, her act of killing Hannah, was connected to that particular delusion. You saw me up here ask the expert, I said, tell me the particular delusion. Because what got lost is that we just talk about in her life she's had delusions. That's not the question. And we tried very hard to sort of narrow the scope. I want to know when she was in that room what she was suffering from. I want to know her state of mind at that time, because it is whether she was operating under the compulsion of a delusion at the moment she committed the act, at the time of the crime. There are tons of people in this world who have had delusions or are mentally ill and do not meet the legal definition of insanity. So we need to know, was she suffering from the compulsion of a delusion? What was that particular delusion, and was it connected with the act that she committed? And when we talk about that, it's like if she has a delusion about, there being 169,000 people in the world, what does it have to do with killing Hannah? Those two things are not connected. So there was a lot of religious stuff, a lot of paranoia, a lot of things about, my parents are being watched by the CIA or are the CIA. None of that has anything to do with her motivation and her act of killing Hannah. And that is why, in the questioning of all of these experts, I focused very clearly on what were her delusions that related to Hannah? What were her delusions that related to why she killed this baby? That were connected to the victim and connected to the act. Every other delusion, ignore it. It is meaningless under the law. The third prong that has to be present, and this is very important, the delusion has to be to a fact that, if true, would have justified the act committed by the accused. What does that mean? Justification under Georgia law is basically Georgia's self-defense laws. The delusion she was suffering under has to relate to the particular delusion, has to relate to the act she committed, and the delusion has to be as to a fact that if we assumed it was true, it would justify the act or permit her to act in self-defense. I'll give you an example of one that would. If she was in that room with Hannah, and she believed that Hannah morphed into a demon right in front of her and was about to kill her, and she picked up the knife and stabbed Hannah in self-defense, that would be a delusion, if true, that would justify the act, because she would have believed she was in immediate danger of receiving death or serious bodily injury from that baby, and under the self-defense laws of the state of Georgia, if we assume that delusion was true, she would be justified in defending herself. That was not the nature of her delusions. None of them. And we asked every single witness, did she ever say anything about being afraid of Hannah? Did she ever say anything about Hannah being a threat to her or anyone else? Did she ever say anything about needing to defend herself against Hannah? Because that third prong of delusional compulsion requires that if we assume the delusion is true, it has to legally justify her acts. She has to be acting in self-defense if we believe whatever is going on in her head. And no matter how crazy the things were that were going on in her head, not a single shred of evidence has come before you that she ever believed Hannah was a threat to her. And we know that regardless of whether she was having delusions in that room or not, she was not acting in defense of herself or others and was not protecting herself or others from that baby. What we know is that what she has told everybody is that she was more motivated by wanting out of the situation or wanting to save Hannah. That is the opposite of justification and self-defense. She didn't view Hannah as a threat at all. And the defense pointed out in this case, well, isn't it true that she was holding the baby's hand in the body cam footage? That's a fact that is helpful to the state because it clearly demonstrates she's not threatened by this baby. She's not afraid of Hannah. Whatever is going on in her mind, she doesn't feel like she has to defend herself against Hannah. Maybe she saw this as a mercy killing. Maybe she was just desperate. But there is absolutely no evidence that this was an act of justification, self-defense, based on what delusion was in her mind. Justification under the law is when she reasonably believed that she had to use that force in order to prevent serious bodily injury serious bodily injury or death from Hannah, or whether she believed that she had to prevent the commission of a forcible felony by this baby. There's no evidence of that. None. She does not meet the definition of criminal insanity based upon delusional compulsion, because if she was suffering under delusions when she was in that room, the only delusions related to needing to save Hannah, not to Hannah being a threat that would justify her actions under the law. Delusional compulsion does not apply in this case. The judge is going to tell you that your verdict should be a true verdict. It's one more place in the law where the word true comes in, and a trial is about the pursuit of the truth. It is according to the laws and the evidence as you find it to be, but the judge is going to expressly tell you that you are not to show favor or sympathy to any party. The judge is going to expressly tell you you cannot base your verdict on sympathy. And I think it is important to highlight that you have to look at the facts and the evidence and the law objectively, because there are things about Ms. Driver that are pretty sympathetic. There are things about the situation that she got herself into that are kind of terrible. But the law does not allow you to make decisions about the outcome of this case because you feel sorry for anyone. The law does not allow you to base your verdict on sympathy. So what I ask of you in that regard is when you go back to the jury room, think, do I feel sorry for her for any particular thing? Take your moment, feel sorry for her, and then set that aside. And instead base your decisions on the objective facts and the law, because you've taken an oath and you have a duty to follow the law, and the law expressly tells you you cannot make your decision based on that. Because every victim of crime deserves that treatment. Hannah deserves that. She deserves the objective and fair application of the law and the objective and fair assessment of the facts. That is the law that governs your decision. Obviously, there's going to be a lot more law, but I tried to highlight the things that I think point most directly to the issues before you. After the defense has their opportunity to close, I'm going to come back before you and I'm going to help you apply that law to the evidence that we heard in this case. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. As I told you in the beginning of this case would be difficult to listen to. We also told you from the beginning we had no dispute whatsoever about the facts as to what happened to Hannah Driver on December 8th of 2020. We all agree that the events that occurred that day are nothing short of a tragedy. Ms. Driver never denied that she didn't harm Hannah Nicole Driver on that day. There's also no dispute that she stabbed herself in the neck over 5 times and once in the chest to try to provoke herself. We also told you from the beginning, we're not going to argue about anything related to the facts of this case. This case has always been about Hannah and Chloe's mental state at the time of the crime. That is it. It is clear from the evidence that has been submitted to you that both the state and the defense have shown very clearly Ms. Driver was suffering from severe mental illness at the time of the crime. She was suffering from delusions telling her that she needed to die. There's evidence that she had documented mental health history prior to being involved with Mr. Joyce. There's eyewitness testimony about her condition and the subsequent deterioration in the months leading up to this tragedy. There's evidence that she had been seeking help, communicating to those immediately around her that she was getting worse. And she could not resist those compulsions. She could not distinguish right from wrong. Now, I would agree with the state that they put up a lot of evidence in this case related to Hannah's death. The ER doctor, the medical examiner, crime lab, all of that. All things that we never once disputed.
In fact, we spent, I think, 45 minutes one day about listening to the testimony about fingerprints on a knife. It didn't even have anything to do with this case. There were no fingerprints on the knife. We weren't even disputing the fingerprints or the knife. We've never disputed any of that. We've never disputed cause of death. We've never disputed how law enforcement initially responded to this, or any of the subsequent investigation that occurred in this case. See, in most cases, there's a factual dispute between the state and the defense as to the physical acts involved in a case and the mental intent. Never been an issue with this case. The only question has always been why. It has been about what led us to this deep, dark place. It's always been about Chloe Driver being a young, naive individual with a pre-existing mental health condition that had been previously undiagnosed, mostly based on her age. It has always been about the years of abuse, the coercive control, and living in this cult mentality that exacerbated these mental illnesses. All the experts agree. Ms. Driver was suffering from severe mental illnesses and delusions prior to, leading up to, and on December the 8th of 2020. You also heard from witnesses that described her and had observed that very same behavior well before that day, and on that day as well. There's been evidence to show that she was in the throes of a severe mental health crisis during that 2-month period. There has been no evidence presented by anybody that this was an isolated snap or something that she is faking to achieve a particular result. 3 experts told you that. As I told you when I stood here before you in opening statements, I anticipated that they were going to present this case in a manner to draw at your raw initial emotions and hope that you would make those decisions based on those emotions. They presented this case in a manner in which they wanted you to ignore the evidence regarding her mental illness, her abuse, and all of the players involved in this case, and the realities of what goes on in that cult. They tried to paint this picture that this was just a group of wacky individuals with weird religious beliefs, that they were a peaceful, loving, polygamous family with some wacky religious beliefs. Not the case at all. Jason Spillers gave you a peek into their belief system. After over a week's worth of evidence, it is clear that everyone in law enforcement, everyone, including law enforcement, the experts, medical staff, people who were around her, and even the strangers that encountered Ms. Driver during this time, there is overwhelming evidence that she was severely mentally ill. We have given you several examples of documented red flag events that occurred prior to that date that set the scene for what ultimately happened. Think about the incident involving Sandra Torres. Think about when Benjamin took Hannah from Chloe Thanksgiving Day of 2020. Watch that video she made when she had to go back to get her daughter. The evidence shows that her condition deteriorated, the delusions not only continued, but got worse collectively over time, all building up to that day. We know that her mental state was broken. She was seeing things, she was hearing things, and the delusions were telling her over and over again she needed to die. Over and over and over again. Think about the pictures I showed you in the beginning of this case. The ones of her at 16, the ones of her in the summer leading up to this event. Ultimately, right before the event, when you can see where she is at that particular point in time. You can see the despair, you can see the stress, and you can see the mental illness in her eyes. See, there were signs that she was experiencing these delusions leading up to and on the day of the incident. There was discussions about death. She was seeing things associated with knives that she attributed special meaning to her because of that delusion. The 12 tribes, the dirty shirt. All of these delusions included the belief that she was sin, she was passing that sin on to her daughter, she needed to die, and Hannah was an extension of herself and her sin. She believed that Hannah was so connected to her and part of her that when she breastfed, she was imprinting and downloading all of herself into Hannah. She was experiencing these delusions in her mind that made her believe over and over again that she needed to kill herself and die. Based on her delusion regarding Hannah, she was thinking if she left behind her child, it would be a continuation of her sin and her false belief in that delusion that she was responsible for everything bad in the world. She needed to commit suicide. The act of suicide is what was driven by these delusions. It was not because of jealousy or anything related to Benjamin Ben Michael. Not at all. There's no evidence of that. The state told you in their opening that they were going to show that Ms. Driver was not mentally ill. I think they said crazy in air quotes. That Ms. Driver killed her daughter out of jealousy and some desire to be the only wife. She was not delusional. She just subscribed to some wacky religious conspiracy theories. And she was voluntarily part of this group and free to leave whenever she wanted to. There's been no evidence of that whatsoever. Let's talk about each one of these arguments and break them down. I'm not even going to address the assertion that they made in opening that she wasn't crazy. The evidence on its own speaks to that. There's no evidence that this event had anything to do with jealousy. There's no evidence that she killed her daughter because she wanted Benjamin to herself. The statements she made to law enforcement and hospital staff are not motives. She told Detective Cruz that she wanted a normal family. That's not an abnormal wish, but it's not a motive for murder. How does killing herself and Hannah achieve the result of having Mr. Ben Michael to herself? Or, it's not logical. It doesn't make any sense, and it's not supported by the facts. She did not attempt to harm any of the other wives. She didn't attempt to harm Mr. Ben Michael. If she wanted to have him to herself, wouldn't she have gotten rid of the competition? If she was in her right mind, wouldn't she have taken steps to remove the others from the relationship? That seems to be a more logical response. It seems to me that she would have taken steps to stop those interfering with her wishes, not killed the child or herself. That argument defies logic. Jason also told us here there were no jealousy issues whatsoever within that group. Never any issues of Chloe acting out towards other women in the group, or that she made any demands to have Mr. Ben Michael to herself. Their own witness told you that. They were a happy family. They sat around talking about their feelings. They spent months trying to care for Chloe. There was no lack of attention. Killing Hannah and killing herself does not get Chloe attention. It does not get her alone with her husband. This was in no way a passive suicide attempt. If they had evidence to the contrary of how Jason portrayed their relationship and their life, the state could have presented that to you. Ask yourselves why they did not. The state also argued that Chloe's free to leave at any time and not victim of domestic violence. And because she had access to money, she could come and go as she pleased, leave any time. They argued she could leave him with her daughter at any time. That argument goes against every ounce of training everyone sitting at that table has ever gone about the domestic violence cycle. There is evidence that Chloe had visible hearing injuries on at least 2 different occasions. They know from their everyday practice that victims engage in contact with their abusers despite knowing that they shouldn't be. They know their victims continue to contact their abusers, even when court orders are in place telling them not to do it. They continue to contact their abusers despite knowing what those people are capable of and go back to them repeatedly. They know that victims, in their experience, take steps to plan an escape, but they don't always execute that plan. They are trying to ignore the facts that are supported by their evidence that Chloe Driver was a victim of domestic violence, and she was trying to leave, and deal with that mental illness at the same time. They refuse to see her as a victim in this case because it just doesn't fit their narrative. I'm also just going to say this about domestic violence at the hands of Benjamin. Chloe was not his first, not his only, and certainly won't be his last victim. Gabriella told you how hard it was for her to break herself away from that relationship, both physically and emotionally. She told you about how controlling he was, the physical abuse. She endured the threats he made to her about leaving and never seeing her child again. You got to hear about that experience directly. You got to hear about the abuse, the control, the emotional connection, her feelings of worthlessness, and the difficulty from separating from him with a child. You heard her tell you that despite being subjected to all of those things, she would leave and come back to her abuser. It fits within the cycle of violence. It fits what happened in this case as well. You heard her tell you that it finally took her getting the strength and confidence and belief in herself and having the assistance of her family members to leave for good. And she never looked back. And what may seem relatively straightforward to us is inexplainable about why you would go back. You heard Detective Cruz here on cross-examination tell us in further detail just how hard it is for those types of relationships, especially with a child, to get away from their abuser. She talked to us about how it's not uncommon for women to return to their abuser, remain in contact, or try to find ways to leave, but just don't have the strength to do that. Both Gabriella and Chloe experienced significant trauma bonds with Mr. Van Heckel. They both kept going back to what they knew, what they could expect, instead of moving forward into the unknown. That doesn't even take into account the emotional connection or underlying mental illness. Now, the state's probably going to tell you that whatever happened to Gabriella just doesn't matter. It's not relevant to what happened with Chloe Driver or her mental state. It is 100% relevant because Gabriella endured the exact same treatment and she sat here and told you about it. It was exactly the same as that was described to evaluators, to law enforcement, all by Chloe Driver. These two individuals never talked about their own experiences with each other. Gabrielle told you that she had one contact with her where she tried to explain some of the things she endured and realized that she wasn't getting through to Chloe. Detective Cruz was the one that contacted Gabriella 6 days after this crime had occurred because she knew exactly what she was dealing with based on her experience and following the evidence of their investigation. The control, the power, and the degradation of 2 women by Benjamin. Thankfully, Gabriella was able to escape and did not have pre-existing mental health issues. Thank goodness she was able to protect her child. In the presentation of this case, the state has always minimized what has happened to Chloe leading up to this. They didn't want to discuss her self-inflicted injuries. They didn't put any pictures of that up in evidence. We did. They didn't want you to talk about any of that. They didn't want to discuss the controlling and abusive relationship. They want you to believe that none of it matters in the context of this case. They want you to ignore her cries for help, her behavior leading up to this, the reports about the things she was saying to these people, and her attempts to leave on November 25th and November 26th. Now keep in mind, this case was investigated from the very beginning by Detective Cruz with regard to Ms. Driver's mental state and from the perspective that Chloe was a victim. As Detective Cruz began this investigation, she immediately suspected there was a lot more to the story than she was getting from these cult members. Long before Chloe could even have an opportunity to think of a defense. She sat in that hospital, she hadn't talked to anybody. Detective Cruz had already interviewed everybody. And based on that, you heard Detective Cruz tell you she had contacted other people. She had sought those Asheville police departments. She knew what she was dealing with. You watched videos where Chloe told you that she had been hurt, and where Chloe told Detective Cruz about her black eye. She told Detective Cruz about her paranoia, her state of mind, and you saw the videos of her saying she wanted to die with that baby. Based on that experience with law enforcement with DV victims, she continued to investigate that case. She found additional women, she found those police reports, and more evidence of what that world that Chloe was living in. Now, you also heard from Jason Spillers, and that was quite a treat. He was able to paint a picture of this group in 2 very different ways. First, he was able to tell you about how he knew Chloe, how he knew her to be a loving, caring mother who loved Hannah and did everything for her. He knew her before she decompensated and spent so much time with the group that he knew exactly who Chloe was and what she was like. He told you about the different times he saw her, the changes he noticed, and even talking to Benjamin about getting her treatment. He told you that the group spent the better part of the last 2 months leading up to December 8th of 2020 taking care of Chloe. He told us about her episodes and how she would have these episodes or go catatonic and have no idea what had just happened. That there were dramatic changes just in the time that he knew her. And it wasn't jealousy, it was mental illness. Secondly, I don't know if he intended to do this or not, he painted a very clear picture for you of what life was really like in this group. You could see how he idolized Benjamin. He endorsed all of his beliefs and the life that came with it. It was clear that he and Benjamin viewed women as property, as lesser individuals. He told us that the women are subservient and that they were not capable of having the same conversations as men. I think he used the words, they should be out frolicking and dancing with the babies. He told us that, yep, Benjamin set the standard, and that is what everybody had to live by. He tried to paint a picture of this wild alternative reality that no one was buying about polygamy. We know that he disputed that incident with Sandra Torres. Think about this. If he punched a total stranger for attempting to help Chloe that day, can you imagine what these men do to these women behind closed doors? If Jason is that crazy, can you imagine how his leader is? Ask yourself why they did not let you hear from Benjamin. They didn't call him because they know exactly who he is. The facts of this case are undisputed, so let's get down to the experts. Now, we've all heard from 3 different experts in this case. They all agreed she was severely mentally ill in the months leading up to the event. They all agree she was suffering from delusions at the time leading up to this. Dr. Garrett and Dr. Ballard both diagnosed her with schizoaffective bipolar disorder and borderline personality disorder. We heard this morning that Dr. Zom did not offer any individual diagnosis, that's just her approach to this. But she told you today that she didn't disagree with those, in fact she agreed with them, maybe a slight variation. They all utilized the same resources and collateral information to conduct their evaluations. Both Dr. Garrett and Dr. Ballard told you that even outside of Chloe's self-report, the information provided among those sources of information was consistent and independently verified. Those doctors did not believe she was malingering or presenting in any way to achieve a certain result. The experts have told us that these delusions are defined as a fixed false belief that someone holds on to, even when the evidence shows that there's no way they can be real. They cannot be explained outside of mental illness. They are so unusual that they cannot be explained other than disordered thinking. That delusional compulsion that Ms. Grapper was talking about is defined as if that delusion had been real, it would have justified the conduct. Her delusions in this case were not religious in nature. She believed everyone was out to get her. She believed she had special powers. She believed she had magical thinking about things that she thought she did that impacted the world, that she was receiving specific messages directed at her. Those messages came both in auditory and visual hallucinations, but also those delusions of reference that were referenced by both of the doctors. Delusions are not things that are in line with a person's culture, and everybody knows them to be false. They are not extreme religious beliefs. A delusion that drove Ms. Driver to the point we're at today was the one that you heard from Dr. Garrett and Dr. Ballard and Dr. Zom, was that she needed to die. That is not part of any religious belief system. Those are not agreements for participation in any cult. All the experts agree on this. Now, I know you all sat here and paid attention to all of these experts, and I'm not going to go through everything that they have all talked about, but here's what I want to talk about with respect to each one of those. Dr. Garrett told us that the signs and the depth of her mental illness was ever present, that they existed before her relationship, and that she had been experiencing delusions since adolescence. That's important. That contradicts the state saying that she didn't experience delusions, that this is all made up. Dr. Garrett also told you that she was exhibiting those signs of those visual and auditory hallucinations even after being medicated for over a year and a half. When she met her, she was still exhibiting those signs of that delusional thinking. She was still having issues with suicidal ideation and thoughts that she needed to die. She told us it was clear she was experiencing emotional distress regarding the situation and confusion about the moral and ethical appropriateness of her delusions. She said, Ms. Driver said, I was at peace with how it was supposed to be. You heard that Dr. Garrett believed that she felt she needed to take her life because of her delusions, and everything in the world was telling her, in her mind, that's what she needed to do. Not just because of the delusions about sin, but because of all of those delusions of reference that she was seeing on a daily basis. That she was being told she needed to die. She would see a light bulb, she could see a knife, she could see all of these things that to you and I would mean nothing. But because of the disordered thinking and those delusions, it was feeding into her thought process and delusions. She told us that these delusions were above and beyond any religious teachings or anything that Mr. Ben Michael had ever told Chloe. Religious beliefs don't tell you need to die. She also told you if you take someone who is vulnerable, who is already delusional, and bring them into this type of scenario and start teaching them crazy stuff, you are teaching them something that will only lead to an increase in their problems. Dr. Garrett also told us that Chloe started out as a very vulnerable young lady who was already delusional to begin with, having these thoughts. She also told us somebody that has a personality disorder, mood disorder, and substance abuse was her baseline. These things existed prior to her ever getting involved in this relationship, and that those circumstances only made this scenario worse. She also told us to think about this as not a particular moment in time. Ms. Gropper tried to ask her about the dirty shirt as a trigger, and Dr. Garrett quickly corrected her and said, no, you have to consider all of these signs. And she went through and she listed those signs. She told us that we have to look at this as a culmination of events, not something as a trigger. Now, Dr. Ballard came here yesterday and told us a lot of the same information that Dr. Garrett did. She diagnosed the defendant with the same illnesses, and in her opinion, believed the acts were driven by that thought process. She told us that some of the things that the state seems to believe were deliberate acts or tries to persuade you to believe were things that she premeditated and thought out in her head before doing it, are actually acts in support of that delusional compulsion. They were acts that were in her mind to finish out what she was being told to do, that she needed to not die. Getting a knife and locking the door are acts that can be attributed to carrying out that delusion, is a way to act on that compulsion that kept telling her she needed to kill herself. That's an explanation that's rooted in science and in psychology. She told us that these people in delusional states can do everyday things and appear like it's normal. She also told us that these Google searches show that Ms. Driver was attempting to resist acting on those compulsions to the best of her ability. She sought ways out. She sought ways to get help. She was also able to explain to you from the psychological standpoint that the statements made by Chloe to law enforcement after the incident don't necessarily mean anything when you're talking about the mental state at the time of the crime. She also talked about the jail calls and continued communication that Chloe had with Mr. Ben Michael, and explained it in the context of not only Chloe's mental health issues, but in the context of her experiences while she lived in that relationship. The state played you a few phone calls in this particular case, all including her mother. What it tells us, based on those calls that you listened to, is the true depths of her mental illness and her entanglement to him. The jail calls you listened to still show that even when she was incarcerated, she was still controlled and manipulated by him. Notice how they didn't play any of the conversations with Mr. Ben Michael. She also told us that people who are mentally ill, who have not received therapy, who have not been properly medicated, make irrational choices. The jail is not a therapeutic environment. and that to treat all of Chloe's issues, a great deal of treatment was needed, not just medication, to break that bond. Her testimony, Dr. Zom testified today, really didn't dispute any of the other two doctors in this case. She told you that Chloe was suffering from the same type of delusions and mental illness in the months and leading up to this event. All the doctors are consistent with that understanding of her severe mental illness. They all agree that it was untreated, and based on their diagnoses, would only get worse the longer it remained untreated. Each of those doctors agreed that the delusions that Ms. Driver experienced grew more and more pointed to the idea that she needed to kill herself and ultimately her child. Dr. Zom also agreed that the specific delusions that Chloe was experiencing on December the 8th culminated in the final delusion regarding the dirty shirt, and that was a sign she was unable to overcome. Now, I just want to talk briefly a little bit about the treatment of the experts in this case by the District Attorney's Office, and I think that this needs to be discussed. Mr. Fogus spent a lot of time yesterday with Dr. Ballard, trying to emphasize some perceived bias as a defense expert. Neither Dr. Ballard, nor Dr. Zom, nor Dr. Garrett have any interest in this case other than providing you an expert professional opinion regarding her mental state at the time the crimes were committed. They have all told you that their roles in these cases is not based on reaching a particular result. No defense attorney ever contacts them or contacts any expert and asks them, hey, we need you to do a particular thing for us. At the end of the day, all of the doctors who shared all the same title and the same qualifications, in essence, reached the same general ideas in this particular case. If any of these evaluators believed that she did not suffer from mental illness or had these delusions, none of us would be here today. This is just not how these evaluations work. Now, I think it's important when we talk about Dr. McClendon that you all realize we called her as a witness in our case. The state didn't call her. She became involved in this case because she is employed by the Georgia Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Disabilities. She works for the state. She was provided all of the information in this case that the state could give her to review prior to talking to Ms. Driver. Whether or not Ms. Gropper or Mr. Fogus want to acknowledge it, she was their expert. And their expert agreed with Dr. Zom and Dr. Ballard. She worked for the state. We didn't involve her in this case. We had no choice in Dr. Garrett. See, in response to our evaluation, Ms. Gropper sent a referral to the Department of Behavioral Health. Now granted, Ms. Gropper doesn't get to pick which particular forensic psychologist is assigned to evaluate a defendant. But in this case, the state's own expert, the one who conducted the evaluation on behalf of the state of Georgia, sat up here and told you similar things that Dr. Ballard came in here and told you. Did you see Mr. Fogus or Ms. Gropper attack Dr. Garrett personally when we called her as a witness? No. And she made very similar findings and told you about that here in court. If they didn't like any of the reports in this case, the state could have at any time in the last 3.5 years requested an evaluation by a doctor of their choice. I ask you this, would it have mattered? The answer to that question is no. They all agree she was severely mentally ill and suffering from these delusions. She needed to kill herself and her child. They just don't like that the experts don't align with their theory of this case. Now, the experts are hired to conduct an evaluation in the area of their expertise. They don't give you a particular result. It's not how the system works. Dr. Ballard told you she's done a lot of criminal responsibility evaluations, and maybe less than 10% of those evaluations have yielded an opinion of not guilty by reason of insanity. Dr. Garrett told you she works for the state of Georgia and testifies for both the state and the defense. And yet they came in here and told you similar things. If the Cherokee County District Attorney's Office believed that none of these doctors conducted a thorough and accurate assessment of Ms. Driver in the last 3.5 years, they could have done something about it. The state knows what we all know in this case, that if Chloe was in her right mind, she would never have killed that baby. If Chloe had gotten the help she needed, she would have never harmed her baby or herself. If Chloe had not been in an abusive, controlling relationship with a man more than twice her age, her already existing mental health issues could have been treated. There is absolutely no motive in this case to kill her daughter or herself. There is no reason other than what was related to those psychotic symptoms and delusions she was under on December 8th of 2020. It is now your job to set aside those emotions about the death of Hannah. The evidence shows at the time of the crime, she was not only suffering from delusions that were telling her she needed to die, that she didn't have the ability to distinguish right from wrong. While in this delusional state, the experts told us that everything in her mind was telling her that she needed to die. There's evidence that showed she tried to resist giving in to these thoughts. There is evidence that showed she did not, in these delusions and altered states of mind, she didn't know what she was doing. She didn't know what right from wrong. There is evidence to show that because of her delusions telling her that she and Hannah needed to die, that she was overmastered by the constant voices telling her, you need to die, in her head, and ultimately acted on them. All of this started with undiagnosed and untreated mental illness that resulted in a truly horrible, tragic act. Let me put a few things in perspective that may have helped prevent this from happening in the first place. If Benjamin, Sarah, and Jessica, or Jason, had gotten Chloe help instead of CBD, or ignoring the reality that was right before their eyes every day, Hannah may still be alive. If the Asheville Police Department had arrested Jason and Benjamin on November 25th for the incident where they assaulted Sandra Torres that day, Chloe may have been able to get away and get the help that she needed, and Hannah may be alive today. If Brian had not taken Hannah from Chloe on November 26th of 2020, when he found out her parents were coming to get them, it's fair to say that she might have been able to break away from that relationship if he hadn't left with her daughter. Chloe was never going to leave without her daughter. You heard testimony from Chloe's mom about how she had no idea about the extreme nature of this relationship until it was too late. They didn't have any idea about the mental health struggles. She didn't confide in them because he had convinced her that she couldn't trust her own parents. Every single day, her parents live with regrets and think about those what ifs. What if they had just tried harder? What if they had called the police? What if they had just taken Hannah? It replays in their mind over and over again. Her parents still say, if we had tried harder to get through to Chloe, Hannah may still be alive today. Look at all the times that Chloe was unable to address these significant mental health issues. Those failures led to a deep and darker mental state. They caused Chloe to lose her way as a mother to this child. To that end, I agree with the state. She failed in her ultimate responsibility to protect her child. But the failure of her motherly duties was caused entirely by her untreated mental health crisis. It is clear that but for that paranoia, her hallucinations and her delusions, Chloe loved her daughter. And she fought in every way she knew how, and in the circumstances she was in, to resist those delusions to kill herself and her child. But when those things kept happening to her over and over and over again, were so pervasive in her mind, that's all she could see. She tried to fight it. She was voicing these concerns to everyone. She was telling these people, let me be with her. Help me, get me help. We can see it on December the 8th. We can see that she was having these delusions, beginning with the 12 tribes, associating the discussion that they were having that day about death as a sign that reinforced that earlier delusion. We talked about the paranoia that she experienced at Whole Foods, the delusion about that room in the house, and being alone, and that ultimate final delusion of the dirty shirt that overwhelmed her ability when she gave in. Now the court's going to give you instructions regarding the law for you to consider in this case. It is now your job to apply that law to the evidence that you have heard over the course of the last week. As Ms. Cropper kind of touched on briefly, you're going to be given a verdict form that allows you to decide this case in 4 different ways. The not guilty, guilty, guilty by mentally ill, or not guilty by reason of insanity. In order to find Chloe guilty of the charged offenses, you need to find that she committed the acts and that she had the required intent. And the state has to prove that beyond a reasonable doubt. The judge will charge you about what it means to find someone beyond a reasonable doubt. The option of guilty but mentally ill does not yield the same results as a not guilty by reason of insanity. And I want you to keep that in your head. A finding of not guilty by reason of insanity, and the judge is going to give you an instruction on this, allows this court to maintain the custody and control over an individual for the evaluation and treatment of her mental health needs. And that can be indefinite. The law allows a person to be found not guilty by reason of insanity if they did not have the mental capacity to distinguish between right and wrong at the time of the crime. The law allows this because because of mental disease, she acted in such a way that delusional compulsion overwhelmed and overmastered her will to resist. Now, we've all talked about the delusions and what a delusional compulsion really is, but in this case, she was compelled to act in this manner because in her mind, she believed she was right. She believed if the facts were as she believed them to be in her head, she was right. The testimony you've heard in this case was that these delusions were directing her to die. There is evidence to show that she experiences these delusions of reference, these auditory and visual hallucinations, these command hallucinations, paranoia. You heard testimony that Chloe believed based on that delusion, she was downloading all of herself into Hannah and viewed her as an extension of herself. You heard Dr. Ballard tell you that the people with these type of disorders have a very difficult time distinguishing boundaries or when one person ends and another begins. You've heard testimony that people suffering from the same illnesses as Chloe are often unable to distinguish the boundaries. She didn't necessarily know where Hannah began or ended. She didn't know where she began, where she ended. She viewed her in her mind as one unit. She was not going to leave behind any piece of her in this world to perpetuate that ongoing sin, which told her she needed to die. It is all part of the delusion. Now, the state began their opening statement, and again today, asking you for justice for Hannah. We agree. There is justice for Hannah in this case if you find her not guilty by reason of insanity. There is no doubt that our client committed these horrific acts. Never contested that. I want to be clear, though, that in this case, justice looks different than what we're used to. Our society has certain ideas about mental illness and has created a very strong perception that mental illness is an excuse for someone who commits a crime. The law recognizes that severely mentally ill people cannot perform the required criminal intent to commit a crime. The law allows you to find Chloe not guilty by reason of insanity if you believe at the time of the crime she was suffering from mental illness and that she did not have the ability to distinguish right from wrong. You're also allowed to find her not guilty by reason of insanity if you believe that due to her mental illness, she was suffering from a delusional compulsion that overmastered her will to resist committing the act. We know that Miss Driver was in a delusional state. She was confused as to what was right and what was wrong, and resisted acting on those delusions for a long time. In that type of mindset, in the throes of a severe psychotic episode, there is no way she had the ability to distinguish right from wrong at that time. And she was left untreated. And she got worse and worse. Now, Ms. Robert talked to you a little bit about the delusional compulsion part of that, but we know from the evidence in this case that she was severely mentally ill, that she was suffering from delusions that compelled her to act in a particular manner. That if right, that would have been right if if they had been as she believed them to be. If you find that Ms. Driver, based on those delusions, that she believed her actions were right, and as she believed them to be, she would be justified. The evidence has been clear that she needed to kill herself, and by extension, Hannah. She could not separate her identities at that particular time. Now, I want to tell you, suicide in and of itself is not a crime. In her mind, she was being told to kill herself and any part of her. Her intention, based on those delusions, is to follow through on that. And the delusions were telling her to commit suicide. Those right actions in her mind are what led to those events. As I told you, this case has always been about the why. And I think you just need to think about this in the context of how we got here today. Chloe was a young, naive individual with pre-existing mental health issues. She already walked in with that baseline to this relationship. She suffered years of abuse, coercive control, and a cult mentality. We've heard about she asked for help, she cried for help, and attempted to leave. We've heard that all the experts agree that she was suffering from severe mental health issues, and that untreated, undiagnosed individuals treating those type of illnesses get worse over time. They just don't go away. As we told you in the beginning of this case, mothers just do not kill their children. We told you to ask yourself what drives someone to do something like this to their baby and themselves. What drives someone to stab themselves 5 times in the neck and once in the heart? What drives someone to do this by someone who all reports loved and cared for that child in the most amazing way? And the only explanation is those severe psychotic symptoms and delusions she was experiencing. Now, I want to be clear. A finding of not guilty by reason of insanity does not mean that she walks out of this courtroom or is not held accountable for her actions that day. It means that she is committed to the state hospital to get the treatment she needs. Justice in this case for Hannah is getting her mother the treatment she so desperately needs. A verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity is not an excuse. It is a way the law allows an individual in Chloe's position to be held accountable based on those things. It is the why. It does not mean she's not held accountable. It does not mean there's no justice for Hannah. It means she gets the treatment and the help she needs. The only verdict in this case, supported by the evidence, to each and every count in that indictment, is not guilty by reason of insanity. To each and every count, because we have met the burden that we have, that she could not distinguish right from wrong, and that she was overcome and overmastered by those delusional compulsions that in her mind justify that act. Thank you.
All right.
Ms. Trethaway just stood up here and said that if Chloe believed her actions were right, then she would be justified. That's not the law. And she's conflating the two different ways to prove insanity. Her ability to distinguish between right from wrong and delusional compulsion. The two don't overlap. Those are two different ways to prove insanity. If she just said to you, if Chloe believed in her mind she was justified, then she's insane. That's not the law either. And you don't have to believe me, the judge will tell you. The delusion, if true, would have legally justified the act. If we assume what was in her mind, it is legally justifiable under Georgia self-defense laws. That's the law. It doesn't matter what Chloe thought was justified. The only thing that matters with regard to her distinction between wrong and right is the other part of the insanity charge, whether she had the ability to distinguish between right and wrong. When we're talking about whether the delusion was as to a fact, if true, would justify the act, we're talking about legal justification under the laws of Georgia, not about what Chloe Driver thinks about it. It's also important to me to address the fact that Ms. Strathaway indicated the state wants you to ignore all this stuff about her mental state. They just put up all this gory evidence to play on your emotions, even though Ms. Driver has never disputed the fact that she committed these acts. Except she has. She pled not guilty. We have the burden of proving the murder. I have to. It is my job. I'm not going to phone it in when we have a murder of a 13-month-old child just because I know her defense is insanity. I still, under the law, I have the burden of proving the murder. And I'm going to put up every ounce of evidence that I need to put up in order to do that. And that is not to play on your emotions. The fact that it was emotional, and the fact that it's horrific, and the fact that that body cam is going to haunt all of our dreams for a very long time is because of the actions of Chloe Driver, not because I'm trying to manipulate you. The state has a duty, and our duty is to represent Hannah. She was murdered in Cherokee County, and we have to prove her guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And my presentation of evidence to you in that regard was following my oath. It was not to manipulate you or to convince you to ignore anything. I don't want you to ignore any evidence that came before you. Ms. Trethaway said, well, the state could have gotten another evaluation if they wanted to. None of the evaluations that have come before you meet the definition of legal insanity. Why would we keep asking for evaluations? It's their burden to prove insanity, and they haven't done it. Because none of the evaluations demonstrate that she doesn't understand the difference between right and wrong, or that she had any specific delusions that, if true, would justify the act, if true, would allow her to defend herself against Hannah. She could be evaluated by 10 more doctors. There's no evidence in this case that she meets the definition of legal insanity. And the state has never tried to pull the wool over your eyes, or ask you to ignore evidence, or ask you to be distracted. We have just asked you to focus on the actual issues in this case. And the fact of the matter is, it is their burden to prove insanity. It is not our burden. She is presumed sane under the law. It is our burden to prove the murder. It is their burden to prove insanity. I want to talk to you about some of the evidence that came before you. And one of the things that we need to talk about is Jason Spillers. I know everybody in the free world was questioning the wisdom of my decision to put this man on the witness stand and let him ramble on incessantly. I promise you it was not because I am a pea-brained female who is not capable of intelligent thought like Mr. Spillers would like you to believe. He provided some very valuable information, and he provided context to some things that you needed to have. There were statements made by Chloe Driver in this case about his new friends in the group, about her new existence, about how things had changed when he had gotten these new followers. Who do you think she's talking about? Old Crazy Pants. And he took this witness stand and talked about drinking his own pee, talking about all of his crazy views about women and their inferiority and how they're not capable of intelligent thought. And most of what he had to say was complete garbage. And I expect that most of what he had to say, you all will probably completely disregard. But what became very clear is that him and Benjamin had this little intellectual bromance. And they probably sat around and acted like they were the two smartest men who ever lived on the face of the planet. And things got different for Chloe and Hannah and the other women because Benjamin was in this little romance with his smart buddy, Jason Spillers, and the women were supposed to giggle and play and go do the things that women do because they're not smart enough to participate in intelligent thought. And so things got different for Chloe Driver, and she didn't like it. Those were her statements. You seeing it with your own two eyes, what her existence was, her wanting to get far away from Jason Spillers is not insane. That's reasonable because everybody in this courtroom felt the same way. They did not want to be around him because he was difficult to be around. And so he needed to come before you. You needed to see that with your own two eyes because it provides context to her statements about why she did what she did and why she was feeling the way she felt. And what were those statements? We knew that Jason Spillers was new to this group and that he had met Z in April of 2020. Chloe's been in the picture 3 years, and it was just the last couple of months when things really went to go sideways. And it was after he joined the group. This is telling. He started spending a lot of time with them around July of 2020, and it definitely provided context for her statements to the detective. The first thing she wrote about why she did it, he didn't do it, I did it. I was going insane, I no longer wanted to be with his friends, but kept coming back for him. I only wanted my baby and husband, but he refused. When she said, I no longer wanted to be with his friends, she's talking about Jason Spillers. And you needed to see it. You needed to see it because her reasons and her motivation behind committing this act wasn't her delusions, it was her reality. It was the day-to-day life that she was subjected to having to be around these two men. Her motivation was her reality, not her delusion. And you saw it. She told us why. When I stood up here in my opening statements, I said, pay attention to the why. It will help you solve the legal equation. It will help you put the pieces together. Why did she commit this act? This is when she was writing to Benjamin. No, I went to get a knife. I couldn't handle being with the group anymore, and you left me no alternative with certain threats. Taking the money and not letting me just buy land and be with her as long as I needed. You had the whole group to take care of and blamed me for all the problems. These were her statements to Benjamin. She was fed up. She didn't want to be with this group. She didn't want to be with his friends. She wanted a normal life for her baby. She did not want him to keep recruiting more wives and more people to have to take care of and divide the attention even more. These were her statements. I just wanted to have a normal life for Nipsey. These were the very first statements that she was making to the people she cares about, her mom, Benjamin, and to the detectives in the case about why she committed the act. None of this is delusional. It is all very, very rooted in her reality, which was a living hell. These are her notes to the doctor that evaluated her shortly after she was hospitalized. I was stating for months I couldn't handle my husband's lifestyle anymore. She didn't want to be around all these people. He collects people to live with us, and after we got 3 more people, Sarah, Jessica, Jason, I started perceiving them as ganging up on me and leaving me out and changing stories. She's referencing the existence that was her reality. She is not referencing delusions. And you saw 4 hours from Jason Spillers, which was a little glimpse of what every day of her life must have been like. For the first 2 years, not so much because it was just us traveling, but once he got people listening to him more, I started feeling scared and was begging for attention for us to be with the baby. These were the things that she wrote about why she committed these acts. They're not delusional. They're reasonable. Because wanting a husband and a child and not being in a cult, that's not unreasonable. That's not irrational. It's not delusional. That is a reasonable thought process. It was just the realities of her situation that she chose to commit the act she did because she could not deal with the reality of the situation that she chose to put herself in. The doctor who evaluated her in the hospital, patient felt the only way out was to kill her daughter and herself. He did not notate that she killed her daughter because of any delusions. He notated that her motivation for committing the act was because her and her daughter, it was the only way for them to get out. And that is not a delusion. And that is certainly not a delusion that, if true, would justify the act under the self-defense laws. This is not criminal insanity. This is her making a decision out of desperation because of the situation that was her reality. She told us why she did it. November the 25th of 2020, she Googles killing someone to save them. This is consistent with what all the doctors said about what she said about her feelings about Hannah. The last doctor, Dr. Zom, said essentially the overarching theme of things, whether they were rooted in her religious beliefs or rooted in her delusions, the overarching theme was, saving her daughter from a life of suffering. And that's consistent with what we know she Googled on November the 25th. And that is not a delusion that, if true, would justify the act. It is not insanity under the law. She was not motivated by her delusions or her insanity. She was motivated by her reality. And I think what kind of highlights that is, ironically, the testimony of Gabriella Kuykendall, Benjamin's ex-wife. She said it was difficult to leave. She said she didn't have mental health problems and she thought about killing herself. It was a difficult existence that they found themselves in. And she wasn't delusional at all. She thought about just ending it. Not because of delusions, but because of reality. Because of the circumstances that they experienced. I want to talk to you about the evidence that demonstrates that she understood the ability to distinguish between right and wrong. Dr. Ballard indicated, when asked if she thought her behavior was wrong, Chloe Driver expressly said, yeah, as soon as it happened, I regretted it. I thought I shouldn't have done this. This was not supposed to happen. Dr. Garrett, she recalled apologizing to Hannah and told her daughter how much she loved her. I knew this was wrong from the beginning. These are the statements that she made from her own mouth to these doctors. And Dr. Zom, who testified last, said, that's not inconsistent with my assessment of the situation. You saw one of the first things that she wrote was, how long is my prison sentence going to be for killing her? It was very, very clear that she appreciated the consequences of her actions. She understood the wrongfulness of it, but she still did it. This was not an inability to distinguish between right and wrong. She chose to kill Hannah knowing it was wrong. And she said that out of her own mouth. Now, when we talk about the delusional compulsion, I gave you the law, and I want to just refresh your memory on it one more time because it was misstated by Ms. Trethewey. The defendant has to be laboring under the delusion at the time of the commission of the act. The criminal act itself has to be connected with the particular delusion, and it has to be as to a fact that, if true, would justify the act under Georgia self-defense laws. And we talked about that. In order to justify the act, she would have to believe that force, that killing her, was necessary to prevent serious bodily injury or death to herself, or to prevent Hannah from committing a forcible felony. There's zero evidence of that. There is no evidence and no possible way that this third rung of the delusional compulsion insanity defense can be met. Dr. Garrett, when she testified, she indicated she did not ask Chloe any questions about the cult dynamics or the conflict in the cult, despite the notes that Chloe wrote in the hospital, the ones that we just talked about, the ones that sort of demonstrated what her motivation for committing the act was. The doctor did not ask her about the dynamics of the group, did not ask her about the cult culture. She also did not ask her any details about the crime itself. She didn't give any details about what she was doing in that room, what the play-by-play was. If your inquiry is what was her state of mind at the time she committed the act, then the circumstances surrounding the act are really important. And Dr. Garrett instead said she didn't find it to be particularly relevant. She said, I asked her what she was thinking and how she was feeling. Except for Dr. Garrett is not her therapist. This is a question of legal insanity. It is a question of law. And Ms. Trethewey indicated that Dr. Garrett is the state's expert. Dr. Garrett works for a state agency in the same way that, like, a teacher might be a state employee. She's not the state's expert. We didn't hire her. We didn't retain her. The facts that came before you is I sent her a referral form after there was a court order for her to complete an assessment. Dr. Roberta Ballard is a private doctor that was hired by the defense. Then the state agency did an evaluation of her. Then an independent expert did an evaluation of her. That is all very common procedure in criminal cases. So when she says this is the state's expert, it is the state's expert in the context of she works for a state agency, but not the state of Georgia that is prosecuting this case. She is not affiliated with us. I want to talk to you about, I completed this chart with her on the stand. And I said, tell me what the delusions were. Give them to me. What did she say were the delusions? Because this jury is going to have to make decisions about what the particular delusion was that she was laboring under, whether it was connected to the act, and whether that delusion, if true, justified the act. That's your legal equation. And so we went through these. And so she indicated the particular delusions connected with the act of murdering Hannah was that everything was telling her to do it. People talking about death, thinking she should do it. Seeing knives. So let's play that out for a minute. Here's a knife. I see it. We're going to assume that everything in my head is true. And my head is telling me that everybody in this jury box is telling me to take this knife and go stab Mr. Focus. So if we assume that's true, that all 14 of you, 15 of you, are telling me, Katie, take that knife and go stab her. Do it. Take the knife, go stab her. Would I be legally justified in doing that? No. Absolutely not. Just because the whole world and the whole room wants me to kill him, it doesn't mean I'm legally justified in doing it. And that's what I mean when I say that if we assume it's true, it has to justify the act. And that's why it's really a narrow category, very narrow category of cases where the person that is killed or harmed is perceived in their mind to be an immediate threat to them. Hannah would have to be an immediate threat to her. If Mr. Fogus, if I looked at him and I was having a distorted thinking or a delusional thought and I thought he was about to hurt me, and we assume that my delusional thinking is true, then maybe I'd be justified in defending myself and hurting him back. But that is not the evidence in this case. And none of these delusions, which ones, if true, would justify the act? And the answer is 0. There are none. Absolutely not a shred of evidence that she ever thought Hannah was a harm to her or anybody else. Dr. Ballard, when she was asked about things that Chloe Driver actually said close in time to the crime, which is the handwritten notes, I asked her about Mr. Fogus asked her about the handwritten notes. She indicated that it's misguided to assume that anything she said a day later is controlling. But the fact of the matter is, the legal question, is what her state of mind was at the time she committed the offense. A lot of people gain insight into their behavior and their actions and the things that they did as time goes on. But the pertinent question for you is, what was her state of mind in the moment that she committed the offense? So in that regard, don't you think that her statements close in time, her condition close in time, her mental state close in time is the most relevant? And she just disregarded it. The question is, what was her mental state at the time of the crime? I really do not want to revisit all these body cameras gratuitously, but she is making statements and I need you to hear them. She has presence of mind. She understands the situation. She says repeatedly, let him be with her.
Please let him be with her. Please let him be with her. Please let him.
Just get there 39.
Please let him be with her.
Just get there 39. Come on.
Please.
Take him. Come on, downstairs. Come on. Hey, let's quick now. Come on, quick.
She's not delusional. She's oriented. She knows exactly what's happening. She wants the baby's dad to be able to be with her when she dies. She understands the severity of the situation. She is mentally there.
What?
The EMT calls Hannah a boy, and she corrects her. She says it's a he, and Chloe says it's a girl. She has a severe presence of mind. She knows exactly what is happening in that room. She says, is that it? That's goodbye? She understands the consequence of her decision to stab that baby. She understands that her death is impending, and she understands the wrongness of her actions. And she shows us that in the minutes after she committed the act. She asks whether Hannah's still alive. She is not delusional or unclear about what she just did or why she did it. She has presence of mind. She understands the consequences. She understands the permanency, and she understands the result. Dr. Ballard focused primarily on Chloe Driver being a victim of coercive control. There was a lot of testimony about her being a domestic violence victim. And one of the things that Ms. Trethaway said that maybe just landed a little wrong for me is that, everybody at this table, this goes against everything that they've ever been trained to believe about domestic violence victims. And the thing is, I've been a prosecutor for 17 years, and I've done nothing but crimes against women and children my entire career. And I've encountered a lot of domestic violence victims. And I've never stood up here and told you that Chloe Driver didn't experience domestic violence. I have never said that, and I'm not going to say that. What I have said is that Chloe Driver didn't experience any domestic violence in Cherokee County, so we have nothing to prosecute. We have jurisdiction over the crimes that were committed in Cherokee County, which was the murder of Hannah Driver. And the other thing I know about domestic violence victims is they don't get a free pass under the law to murder their children. no matter how bad their situation is, the law still has to apply to them. Just because they have experienced something terrible in their life does not give them the right to murder innocent, defenseless little children. And that is not because we don't care about domestic violence victims. It's because the matter before us and the crime committed in Cherokee County and the relevant issues in this case are not domestic violence. They're murder of a child. It is clear that some of these experts and the defense really don't place any responsibility on Ms. Driver at all for any of her actions. And it's something I ask you to consider and think about in the context of a cult. Because in theory, if there is one cult leader and then there are all these cult followers, are we to believe that any criminal actions by anybody who joins this cult, they are no longer responsible for? They don't have to answer for their choices and their decisions because there's one person that's manipulative and controlling at the top. So now all of a sudden everybody is absolved themselves of criminal responsibility and free will. But that is not the law. You cannot join a cult or an oppressive situation or be in an abusive relationship and now the law no longer apply to you. You still have to answer for your decisions. You still have to suffer consequences of your criminal actions. The judge is going to tell you that the evidence that came before you about the abuse of Chloe Driver by Benjamin is really only relevant to for a very narrow reason. And the statement's not trying to ask you to ignore anything or distract you or have you look away from things. It's just really not the question before you, whether or not she was abused. The judge is going to tell you that the only relevant purpose for that testimony is whether or not it sheds light on her mental state. That is relevant to her insanity defense. So to the extent that her abusive, controlling, oppressive situation, we've never said she didn't experience those things. She probably did. It's just not really the issue before you to diagnose or decide. But to what extent do those things have an impact on her mental state? And what I want to tell you is the defense expert kept using the term coercive control. And the truth is coercion is not a defense to murder under the laws of the state of Georgia. So the only thing you're concerning yourself with in this case is whether or not she meets the definition of insanity under the law. And even if you take these abusive events and you think about how they might have impacted her mental state, you still have to determine whether she meets the definition of insanity. You still got to go back to those two tests. Could she distinguish right from wrong? And was she suffering under the compulsion of delusion that, if true, would justify the act? So even assuming that you believe she was this oppressed victim of domestic violence by Benjamin and you believe all the stuff about what her treatment was probably like, she still, in order for it to be a defense, has to meet the definition of insanity under the law. So you have to put that evidence about her treatment by Benjamin into the proper context, and the judge will tell you the only context that it is relevant to in this particular case in terms of solving the legal question before you is to what extent you think that impacted her ability to distinguish from right from wrong, and to what extent that impacted her delusions that were connected to the act that, if true, would justify the act. And once you kind of do the math and do the equation, you will arrive at the conclusion that none of the delusions would justify the act legally, and that she clearly understood the permanency of her decision and the consequences of her actions. Dr. Ballard also did talk a little bit about her diagnostic testing, and I think this is important to discuss. Ms. Driver had an invalid score on her assessment, and she over-endorsed and over-reported symptoms. And so there was questioning by Mr. Fogus about that, because that's obviously concerning in the context of a forensic evaluation when the test scores essentially show that she's exaggerating. And it showed that she had very high scores and that she had a motivated response. But when asked about it, the doctor basically indicated, well, it could mean that she's trying to get herself out of trouble, but I just interpreted it as a cry for help. She chose instead to interpret it as she's just piling on all these extra symptoms and exaggerating her symptoms because she's desperate for help. But the fact of the matter is she's already in the jail, she's already receiving mental health help, she's already medicated, she's already away from him even though she's continuing to reach out to him and call him. So why did this expert choose to discount the possibility that Ms. Driver was potentially exaggerating her symptoms to benefit herself in a criminal case and instead just chose to call this a cry for help? It's something to consider with regard to Ms. Driver, because we know some things about her. She's not dumb. She has above average intelligence according to the last expert. She manipulated the doctors and the jail staff in order to get access to an unrecorded office line where she was supposed to speak to only her lawyer and her mother when she is in jail for murder. And she uses this unrecorded office line and abuses those privileges to continue to call him. Of course, once it's detected by us, they immediately revoke her privileges and put an end to it, but then what does she do? She continues to communicate with him after his number has been blocked by the jail,
and intentionally does not share that information with the doctors that are evaluating her because it doesn't fit into the narrative that she's desperately trying to escape him and she's being held against her will. The state has never said she wasn't a domestic violence victim, but this narrative that she was held against her will and she couldn't leave and she had no access to money and he would take her phone, it's not true. Maybe he was controlling her mind, but the undisputed evidence is she had a phone in her bag, she had $1,000 in her bag, she had spent 2 days at her parents' house just days before she murdered her daughter. She didn't say anything to her parents about wanting to go get mental health help or thinking about killing her baby. Ms. Trethewey stood up here and said, well, all these people could have done something to prevent it if Jason and Benjamin and Sarah and Jessica would have just gotten her help. But she was at her parents' house for 2 days, right before this happened. That video on November the 27th when she said, he has my baby against my will, she went to her parents' house after that. That's what the evidence was. And she said, Ms. Trethewey stood up here in front of you and said, she was not going to leave him without her baby. She had to go back to him. She was not going to leave him without her baby. The evidence is she was not going to leave him, period. Because her baby was dead. She murdered her baby. And then she continued to communicate with him for over 2 years. Murdering Hannah in her rational, medicated, stable state, understanding she murdered her own child, she continued to reach out to him and call him over 600 times. This wasn't about Hannah. Hannah could not be held over her head. Hannah could not be stolen away by Benjamin. Hannah was gone. Hannah was dead. And she still made that choice. And the thing is, there are consequences for choices. If you want to get away from somebody, there's no better place than the county jail because he can't get in and he can't call you. But she found ways to get to him. She convinced 6 other inmates to use their phone pins for over 2 years so she could continue to contact him and had 617 calls. All of this was while she was medicated and stable and not delusional. She learned from the best in terms of her ability to manipulate the process, manipulate the system. The evidence in this case is that these groups were fraudsters by trade. They had plans to go steal houses that were bank-owned on Zillow. They had taken out all these COVID loans. They didn't have any insurance. They had all this trust documentation. They found out ways to get free cars. They had tons of money. None of these people had jobs, and they had a ton of money in the bank because they would just lie, cheat, and steal from the government in a way that benefited them. And the questioning of Dr. Zom at the end was, oh yeah, she understood. She knew the inner workings of how to game the system. She was very, very educated and knowledgeable about it. She told Dr. Zom she was 80 pounds when she entered the hospital, which was a under-report of 33 pounds from what her actual weight was. And maybe that's not a significant fact to you, but it's just a fact that's not true. It's just something that's not supported by objective, independent evidence. And so it's something to pay attention to. What is her motive in this case? How is she attempting to paint herself despite her intentional, repetitive conduct to the contrary? She had a conversation with her father just prior to being evaluated by Dr. Zom, where they discussed that she would be screwing herself if she acted normal in that evaluation. Those are things for y'all to consider. What she has to gain or lose in this case. What she might have to gain from over-exaggerating her symptoms. And why her statements at the hospital, when she was at her lowest, and she was sad, and she was wrong, and she's just telling it, why those statements are really the more credible statements about what motivated her act. What did every expert agree on? Every single one. Dr. Zom, Dr. Ballard, Dr. Garrett, they all said she never believed Hannah was a threat to her or anyone else. And because of that, the third prong of that delusional compulsion insanity defense cannot and will not be met. So why did she do it? I've thought a lot about that, and I'm sure you have too. What was the prevailing emotion when she gave in and decided she was going to end it for both of them? Was it desperation? Was it anger at her situation? Was it a mercy killing? Was she saving Hannah? Did she just feel hopeless? Was she mentally ill? It's not the insanity defense. If this is what you think any of her motivation was in committing the act, none of those are insanity under the law. Because no matter how hopeless you feel, no matter how desperate you feel, no matter how angry you feel, no matter how frustrated you feel, you don't get to commit the act of murder. And that is the law. What does the evidence actually show in this case? This was not a fleeting moment of insanity. It wasn't. The evidence shows that she thought about it, that she planned it. She had searched how to snap a neck. She had searched killing someone to save them. And you'll have her searches back there and you can go through them and you see the progression because on about November 22nd and 23rd, she starts questioning the ideologies of the group. Am I sinning? Like,
Should I be with this man that has multiple wives? She's starting to question her reality. She's not questioning her delusions, she's questioning her reality. And then she starts to wonder about what the consequences of those certain things are. None of those are delusional. And then she starts to plan her exit strategy. And the evidence is she was weighing her options. She was Googling, and you can look at her phone and see, she was Googling travel plans. She was Googling bus tickets, how to get a bus ticket for a 13-month-old, woman traveling alone with baby. She was evaluating the other options. She was thinking about leaving. She was desperately tied to him and loved him. And as I said in my opening statement, she could not decide if she wanted to stay or go, so she picked a different option. And that is what the evidence shows. She was so desperate to not know which one she wanted that she just decided to end it for both of them, except for she was unsuccessful for herself. She was at her parents' house for days between when she Googled those thoughts of wanting to kill Hannah and when she actually killed Hannah. That's what the evidence is. So she wasn't deprived of the ability to get the help she wanted. She just wasn't ready to give him up. Her mom said she stayed for a couple of days and then she went to look at some property with him in Knoxville. And we know she wasn't ready to give him up because she stuck it out with him for years, even after she killed Hannah. If killing your own child doesn't wake you up, what does? She made those choices. She was not a captive. She had the ability to go. She had the ability to call 911. She had the ability to access money. That's what the evidence has been before you. She chose not to. This is ultimately what the evidence in this case shows. She was not motivated by her delusions, her insanity, or her mental illness. What she was motivated by was her reality. And it was a reality that she chose over and over and over again. I'm asking you to hold her accountable for what she did to Hannah. Because while there may be some evidence that she's suffered a difficult life or that she's experienced certain things, that does not give her the right to take away the life of a 13-month-old child. That does not give her the right to stab that baby girl who did nothing to her repeatedly. There were so many other choices. So many other choices. And she chose that. There have to be consequences under the law for killing defenseless, innocent children. And when you apply the law, when you do the legal formula, when you look at the insanity laws, you will clearly see she does not meet them. And that the only true verdict in this case is one that holds her responsible for her actions, just as anybody else who committed an act like this would be, to find her guilty. This is the last place that Hannah experienced life. She stabbed this baby girl to death until what the ER doctor said, she was empty. She had no blood left. That was a violent, heinous, horrible way to die. And I don't care how bad your life is, you do not get to do that to this baby girl. And there be no consequences for you. She chose that life, Hannah did not. Hold her responsible. Apply the law. Apply the law in a reasoned way that doesn't play into sympathy, that is objective, that speaks to justice. That is your duty. And when you apply the law and you objectively evaluate the facts in this case, the only conclusion that you can reach is her guilt.
Thank you. Members of the jury, then the next phase of the trial will be that I will instruct you on the law that you should apply to the evidence that you've heard in this case. However, we're going to let you take a recess before I do that. I had mentioned to you at the beginning of the trial that you are not allowed to have any kind of electronic device with you in the jury room during deliberation. So if you have phones, laptops, tablets, anything of that nature with you in the jury box or in the jury room, please remove them from the jury room. You may take them to a vehicle. You may give them to the bailiffs, who will have a box outside the deliberation room so that you can access them during breaks if you would like to. Leave us your notepads. Don't start talking about the case with each other. You have not heard the law that applies from the court yet, and we will see you back, we'll say at 20 till. Be back in the